The rocket-firing Hawker Typhoon is one of those aircraft that is synonymous with the Second World War in Northwest Europe. The aircraft and its weapon are remembered in the public imagination for their tank-busting heroics, closing the Falaise Gap and bursting through into Germany itself. The fact that neither the aircraft nor its rockets were originally intended for the ground attack role is something that is often forgotten. Both were meant to be bomber destroyers, but both would find fame firing down rather than up. So in this episode of the Aviation Show, brought to you as always by the fabulous Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona, we're going to take a look at the RP-3 rocket and its use with the Hawker Typhoon over occupied Europe. The RP-3 would see service with 2nd Tactical Air Force, the both fighters of Coastal Command, and the swordfishes of the Fleet Air Arm. They would also be strapped to tanks and used in the ground attack role. It was a very versatile weapon, if wildly inaccurate. And I'm just going to say it is baking here in Horsham today, so the windows are open, the fans are on, and if I get a little bit glistening, I'm sorry, but it's hot. So enough of that, let's talk about some rockets. So the RP-3 was developed under the code term unrotated projectile and was originally intended to be used as a barrage weapon in the anti-aircraft role or fired from a fighter aircraft to break up an enemy bomber formation. And from reading the original documents in the National Archives at Kew, a lot of assumptions were made. The idea for using the UP would be for a Hurricane to approach the bomber formation straight and level and then fire the rockets at the bombers. The maths required to ensure that the rapid rocket had any chance of a hit was mind-boggling, and not something your average fighter pilot would be working out in combat. The Luftwaffe, interestingly, would have the same idea later in the war when they deployed weapons like the Wurfgranat 21 and the 55mm R4M rocket that they used against the 8th Air Force. In both cases, the chances of achieving an air-to-air kill were infinitesimal, but you could disrupt the formation and allow the other prowling fighters a chance to pick off a straggler. Needless to say, while the rechristened RP-3 would not see much air-to-air action, its potential as an air-to-ground weapon was clear. So let's take a closer look at the RP-3. The RP-3's motor was a steel tube 3¼ inches in diameter and just over 55 inches long. At the tail end, 4 8x5-inch fins were attached to provide stability. At the business end was a shell ring where the warhead was threaded on and would be then held in place with 8 spring-loaded pins. At either end of the rocket motor were saddles that allowed the rocket to be slid onto the projector rails and held in place with a little bit of wire. But what was inside the rocket motor? Well, with the help from our friends at the Aviation Historian, who a while ago I collaborated with on an article about the RP-3 rocket with the fantastic Ian Bott, Ian came up with this animation, which we're going to talk through, to see what was going on inside that steel tube. At the front of the motor was the igniter, which was then connected to the orbiter and some washers with a thermal initiator that would trigger the propellant. The shell ring with its spring-loaded pins to hold the shell in place comes next, along with the spigot which would attach to the front of the motor. The rocket was powered by a solventless cordite propellant, which was ignited by the electrical cable that ran from the back up to the igniter through the center of the propellant. It would then burn from the front to the back, giving the rocket its power. As we've discussed before, the fins and the casings and the saddles came on, and at the business end, the fuse was then inserted into the shell, which was screwed on and secured by the spigot and those springs that we spoke about a moment ago. The first batch of rocket rail projectors included a heavy steel plate to protect the wings of the aircraft. It was in this configuration that test pilot H.W. Dixie Dean picked up Hurricane Mark 1 L1760, a Battle of Britain survivor that had been belly landed more than once, from the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. Loaded up with 8 rockets, Dixie flew down to the firing range at RAF Thorney Island on the 25th of October 1941. In his superb memoir of test flying and armament testing during the Second World War, Druid's Circle, Dixie Dean remembered that first test. We fired a single rocket by remote control, more or less to see what would happen to the long-suffering airplane. It was a very impressive performance. My God, what a din! Rocket exhaust makes a devilish noise, a reverberating howl of anguish that seems to go on forever. Dean's testing of the RP-3 would continue, and with it the revised projectors that would get significantly smaller and lighter as the war ground on. The Mark 1A projector assembly that would be fitted to the Hawker Typhoon in late 1943 would weigh in at a not insignificant 360 pounds. The RP-3 was not being considered for combat in isolation. Out in the Desert Air Force were flying Hurricanes armed with the fearsome 40mm Vickers S-gun.
There are many modified fighter versions. Then came the Harry bombers, and now a new and formidable type, the Hurricane 2D, the tank buster. It is armored with two 40mm cannons slung under the main planes. These, the largest bore weapons yet fitted on any flying aircraft, weigh only 320 pounds. They fire 2.5-pound shells, and the aircraft also carries two .303 machine guns, a devastating total of firepower. The Hurricane 2D is part of our answer to the German tank warfare technique, and a pretty sound answer too. We've got plenty more tricks like this in store, just waiting till they're wanted.
Hurricane Mark 2Ds and 4s were having success tank-busting Panzer 3s and 4s, and a trial was held to determine the effectiveness of the 40mm cannon versus the RP-3 rocket, with 6th Squadron flying out of RF Fayyad in Egypt. The 6th Squadron boys flew sorties against a Grant tank and a Panzer 3. The results were impressive and show each weapon's advantages and disadvantages. The RP-3 was found to be less accurate than the S-gun, but the rocket, should it hit a tank, would be more likely to cause it to brew up. The S-gun's big disadvantage was its harsh recoil. When I spoke with Typhoon pilot Tom Carter at the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight's headquarters at RAF Coningsby in 2018, he told me that when it came to firing rockets, you pushed the button and there was a whoosh and they were gone. The most vital element of that October 1943 test was the recommendation that the S-gun must be used in open, flat country. It is impossible to use in hilly or wooded terrain. In the hilly, wooded confines of Normandy, it was going to be the rocket and not the heavy 40mm cannon that would be the weapon of choice for 2nd Tactical Air Force. If you are an aviation buff and in the southwestern United States, visiting the Pima Air and Space Museum has to be top of your list. Not only are there over 400 aircraft there, including some unique types like the oldest B-52 in existence, the NB-52A mothership, the High and Mighty one, which carried X-15s aloft 72 times to set speed records that have never been broken on the edge of space. Pima Air and Space Museum is open 362 days a year and has everything an aviation geek could want. So do check out www.pimaair.org for more information. And of course, if you get bored with the planes, there are tanks across the street as well. Key to using any weapon is training. And for units being equipped with the new rocket-firing Typhoons, 14 days of training was the recommendation. As 1A1 Squadron became the first operational rocket-firing Typhoon squadron, theirs and subsequent squadrons' performance was closely monitored. Dive angle was vital for accurate rocket firing. Steepening the dive angle meant that the ballistic drop of the rocket was lessened and allowed for a higher percentage of the rockets landing within the target area, which was a phrase that was used by most pilots when reporting their results and was never really clearly defined by anybody. But knowing just how far down you'd put the nose of your Tiffy was easier said than done, as you had no fancy heads-up display and just really a gyro attitude indicator like this one. Being just a little bit out of that optimum angle could have a huge impact on where your rockets went. Analysis on the range found that the average Typhoon pilot was underestimating their dive angle by as much as 10 to 15%. This was important because an error of just 3 degrees in a 30-degree dive could cause a rocket to undershoot the target by around 17 yards. The late great historian Dr. Alfred Price broke down just how fickle the RP-3 was once the pilot pressed the fire button. In clear air, in a 60-degree dive, releasing your 60-pound semi-armor piercing armed RP-3 rocket at 4,000 feet would mean you were roughly 1,500 meters from the target. And this would give the pilot a relatively high chance of a hit or a damaging near miss. For every 140 meters the pilot released his rockets too far from that 4,000 feet, 150 meter sweet spot, the rockets would drop 14 meters short, 140 meters too close, and the rockets would travel 14 meters too far. And this is before you consider any of the other elements. For every 2G that was being pulled, the rockets would deviate by around 27 meters. For every 4 degrees of side slip the pilot used to counteract a crosswind, the rocket would deviate by 46 meters. For every 20-mile-an-hour gust of wind, the rocket would be blown off course by around 27 meters. And all of these calculations would need to be made by a 20-something-year-old pilot diving at 500 miles an hour while being shot at. So while the RP-3 rocket was not a precision weapon, we also have to consider the circumstances in which the rockets were assembled. In July 1944, most of the rocket-firing Typhoon squadrons were now making themselves at home in Normandy. For the Irks and the armourers of the RAF support echelons, the conditions were not ideal for the careful fitting and assembly of the RP-3. So while this footage from the Imperial War Museum shows the armourers very gingerly putting these rockets together, in reality, working in the dusty confines of a former farmer's field that is now an airbase, you have to consider the amount of rockets these guys were having to put together. 184 Squadron, who we're going to talk about a little bit more in a minute, in August 1944, fired 1,383 rockets on their own. And they were not the only squadron on that ALG that the armourers had to service. And it is a credit to the RAF servicing echelons that they managed to keep the Typhoons armed and ready to go for whenever the army whistled for a tiffy. But just how effective were the Typhoons and their rockets? A quick glance at some of the operational research section's reports would leave you saying, not very. For example, after von Kluge's panzers raced to Mortain on the 7th of August 1944, they were met by the stubborn resistance of elements of the US 30th Division on Hill 314 and the combined fighter bombers of 2 TAF and 9th Tactical Air Force. On the so-called Day of the Typhoon, 2 TAF's Typhoons flew hundreds of sorties in support of the 30th Infantry Division and created what they remembered as a Dante's Inferno in the lanes and bottlenecks around Mortain.
There's a lot of places I'd rather talk about than Mortain. That's where I got hit. We've been going great up to there. Some of the guys had even been singing, harmonizing. And then that first German artillery caught us. Pretty accurate, too. An hour later, I was short 18 men. Well, we holed in and we hit back with everything we had. They weren't just trying to stop us, see? They want to come right through. And then me. I get a belt in the face left side and I keeled. The last thing I remember is looking up and seeing those RAF Typhoons. When I heard them screaming up ahead, I thought, geez, I'm glad they're on our side.
They claimed 90 tanks that day as von Kluge was forced back. But when the ORS teams arrived in the following days, they could only identify 17 vehicles of all types destroyed, including 7 tanks. So, does that mean that 2 TAF's Typhoon drivers were inflating their claims? Well, let's look at 2 aspects. 184 Squadron flew 27 sorties in and around Mortain that day. Flight Lieutenant Derek Stevenson flew in JR-371, and his superb memoir, 6 Crashes Later, he recounts that attack. The whole area was filled with tanks and what were most probably the trucks of their supply echelons, soft-skinned vehicles which stood no chance against our cannon, as well as fuel tankers to judge by the height of the flames when one of them was hit. I followed Doug's section down against what looked like 5 tanks and 3 trucks trapped in a narrow lane and unable to move, completely forgetting about the flak and the excitement of getting a tank in my sight. I fired off a pair of rockets at it and opened up with my cannon and then pulled up sharply, almost losing control of my Typhoon as I flew through the slipstream of another aircraft. Twice more we dived to attack the tanks that had been blown up, fortunately without damaging my aircraft. Stevenson was one of 7 184 Squadron Typhoons that made that attack, firing a total of 56 rockets into those congested country lanes. 184 made claims for 5 tanks as smokers, 1 tank damaged, 1 armoured fighting vehicle's a flamer, and another 1 damaged. Considering the carnage they created, it's surprising they didn't claim more. Because if you'd made that attack, you'd flown against a defended target, picked one out amongst the smoke and dust the guys going in before you have created, and after dispatching your rockets and hauling your Typhoon to safety, looking back over your shoulder at all that mess you and your mates just caused, you could be forgiven for making a claim. We also have to remember that the Mortain fighter bombers were rarely acting in isolation. They were flying their sorties in conjunction with, frankly, biblical amounts of artillery. The Typhoons and Thunderbolts did not stop the Panzers alone. It was a team effort. So while destroying a tank is sexy, the reality of Typhoon operations was that they were ranging on deeper interdiction missions where they could find the support troops for the armored fighting vehicles and tanks and starve them of the things they needed most: fuel, ammo, spares, and men. It is hard to kill a tank. It is not as hard to kill a tank crew that is bailed out at the sound of approaching Typhoons, or a trained mechanic in the open working on a broken Tiger's gearbox when you fire a few dozen rockets and hundreds of rounds of 20mm into their encampment. And that's the takeaway when we look at the rocket-firing Typhoon. On its own, it was an effective weapons platform for its time. The effect of an attack by Typhoons of both the rocket-firing and bomb-dropping varieties was such that even if they didn't score a direct hit, they could have a dramatic effect on the morale of both the defender and the attacker, with the attacker getting a significant boost, which is actually something we're going to look at in our next video about the Typhoon and the RP-3 when we dig deeper into the operational research section's reports, which stated famously that there was only a 0.5% chance of hitting a Panther with a rocket, and what Typhoon pilots had against the paddling of Dutch ducks, as we look a little bit deeper into what it actually took to hit something with a rocket. So thank you very much for joining us. Please do all the likes and subscribes. Leave a comment below. Let me know what you think about the video and this series on the Typhoon and her rocket. We're going to be back with that new one soon. And if you want it first, ad-free, even have a look at the script before it gets recorded, join us on Patreon from just £3 a month, and you'll even get your name in credits at the end of this video. So thanks for watching, and do take care of yourselves. Bye-bye. I'd like to say thanks to all of our fantastic supporters over on Patreon. If you head over to our Patreon page, you can join the fun from just £3 a month, plus a bit of fat, get your name in these very credits, and get all the episodes ad-free and early as soon as I get the edit finished.